Hello, good morning, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you for attending this webinar on supporting vulnerable persons in an emergency. Just for your information, I welcome all of you for attending this webinar. All of you as attendees will be muted during the session. And of course, once this session is completed, we will be having a question and interaction session, and you can leave your questions in the chat box. Before I go further, let me introduce myself. My name is Raj K. Prasad. I hold a master degree in environmental science and engineering, and I have approximately more than 32 years of work experience in the field of environmental and health and safety management. And this webinar, the one that you are attending right now, it's a part of BSI Protect Webinar series, which is about basically your people, your systems, and your operations. And the first one of this webinar series, it got out, in fact, and many people attended. And it was basically on 4th of May. And this was maintaining business resilience during disruptive incidents. Second one was done on 7th May, which was about managing psychological health, safety, and well-being in the workplace. And third one is the one that you all are attending. And this is about supporting vulnerable persons in an emergency. So thank you very much. With this brief background, let us understand that when we are talking about vulnerable group or vulnerable person in an emergency situation, this is all about, we are talking about our resilience from our organizational perspective. And when we are talking about resilience from the business perspective, it is not truly a resilience unless we all are together. Means we are not leaving anybody behind with as a big team. So from that perspective, we can be truly resilient if all of us together move ahead. And we all know that in any organization, when we are a part of different team, different nationality, different people, we all have a different kinds of sensitivity. So it differs from the sensitivity and hence the vulnerability in emergency situations. So we need to be all together. So from that perspective, we will try to understand what is vulnerability and in what manner it can be, in what context. We can see the difference of the various people from all of us, that how we can be sensitive to different situations. And then we will also look at from that perspective that if such kind of situation exists in an organization or in a community impacting our business, then in what kind of planning and communication that we need so that we are able to identify, engage, and communicate with the vulnerable groups effectively. And then overall, we will see that, what kind of strategies that we need to have in practice. So what kind of key approach that we need before or during the emergency or after the emergency, so that no one is left behind. And as I mentioned, that ultimately we need to have all together as an organization, as a part of dependence on the other organization or communities or government, local bodies, all of us as a together, we need to make sure that we all are together and managing our business in the right and effective direction. So when we are talking about supporting vulnerable persons in an emergency scenario, let us first try to understand the definition that came from ISO standard. And the two important definitions are very important for us to comprehend. The first one is a vulnerable person. Now, when we say vulnerable person, who is vulnerable person? In that context, if you see the definition, it talks about individual who might be less able to anticipate, cope with, resist, or recover from the impacts of an emergency. So it talks about essentially that who might be less able to anticipate. You all know that we all are a different sensitive people. So maybe some of us may be not be having a very good able to anticipate the individual situations, and also we might have a differently abled or differently sensitive from emergency situation and we may not be able to cope up with. So that differentiation may exist within the group or maybe the individual. And of course, the same person or the group may not be able to resist that vulnerability or emergency situation. And also we need to look at from the recovery from the impact of the emergency. So let's say we have faced an emergency and because of different sensitivity, we are not able to recover from the impact. And it is a different from person to person, it varies. So that is how we identify vulnerable person and or vulnerable group. But one point that we need to also understand in a right sense, that vulnerable group or a vulnerable person, it is not defined by vulnerability of the nature. It is basically the personal circumstances. So for example, myself or yourself, or maybe when we are talking about certain particular small group or a big group, their individual circumstances that defines the vulnerability. So it's not the absolutely the nature of the vulnerability. It is rather personal circumstances for that individual or for that group or for that the team itself that will define during the time of emergency how vulnerability is. It may vary from time to time. It may vary from how the people have been exposed and they have managed themselves from the vulnerability. The other important definition, which is very important for us to understand and comprehend such kind of situations, how to support vulnerable person in an emergency situation, is the carer. Carer is the one. It could be individual, and it basically provides supports to a vulnerable person, and he can be paid, she can be paid or unpaid, but it provides basically a support to the vulnerable person or the group. Now we need to also comprehend that this kind of designation, when we are saying definition carer, it should not be in a kind of situation that he has to be defined like this. In fact, if you look at from the organizational perspective, there are many senior management people, they behave like a carer. In fact, talking to their employee who they think that he or she is very vulnerable, is such kind of emergency situation, they start talking to them, they try to see that what kind of support they need. So those kind of behavior or the skills, they are part of basically carer. So what I mean that here, that when we understand the vulnerable person and carer, it's all existing in an organization. The only point is that in what kind of systematic effort that we need to make sure that we are managing our business disruptions in a manner in an emergency situation that people are least impacted and we continue our resilience. And that is how this standard is giving us an understanding that how we can support vulnerable persons in an emergency conditions. So we would love to hear from you. We have a poll questions. Thank you very much. So we will go to the next part now. As I was mentioning, that it is a part of international standard ISO, and it's 22395. The latest edition is 2018. This standard is part of security and resilience. which talks about community resilience, and it has a guidelines for supporting vulnerable persons in an emergency. This guideline essentially helps us and gives us basically standard process and procedures in terms of framework, how to identify, involve, communicate with the support individuals who are the most vulnerable to natural and human introduced. It could be intentional, it could be unintentional emergencies. It also includes guidelines for continually improving the provision of support to vulnerable persons in an emergency, and for whom this standard is for. So organizations with the responsibility for or involvement in part or the full planning for working with a vulnerable persons in emergency, and who can have this kind of a standard for their organizations. So all types of organization, any size of organization, they have an involvement in emergency preparation or responses or recovering activities such as local, regional, and national governments, statutory bodies, international and non-governmental organizations, businesses, and public and community groups. So whatever that comes into this kind of broad understanding of this applicability, any organization that can become part of implementing such kind of guideline standard. And this standard essentially focuses on to identify vulnerable person, identify vulnerability, their needs during the emergency, and how to manage them, and how to communicate with them, how to, with respect to timeline, how to enhance the resilience of the vulnerable group or the vulnerable person. So this is what this guideline helps us from organizational perspective. Let's go to the next. Look at from the larger objective. We all are part of business, and we have a friends, we have families, we have communities, we have surroundings. Our company has associated suppliers, our organization has customers. So we all are a part of business ecology. So if you look at from that perspective, we need to manage our resilience so that the whole aspect of us, community, ourselves, friend, families, we all are resilient as soon as possible without any disruption. So if you look at from that perspective, it is actually part of community resilience, the way we are setting from our business perspective, friends, families, surroundings, my neighbor organizations, my suppliers, my customers. So if you look at from that perspective, it covers basically that how we can prepare ourselves, how we can respond to, and how we can recover from, and ultimately how do we adapt to various disruptions so that we become resilient and we become back to normal as early as possible. It covers social, economic, environmental, and institutional dimensions. It focuses on collective capacity, not just individual organizations, as I explained. And then, of course, it will help us supporting communities in building resilience systematically. That's how the standard is. The main point is basically a systematic effort. And it enables basically for us to coordinate among the various stakeholders and then complement emergency management and business continuity. And of course, we can enhance long-term sustainability and adaptability. Let us see that how we can identify the vulnerable persons. Vulnerability varies by context, hazard, and time. So different situations, different hazard, different time. People, if they are having exposed to, and if they have faced already, they become more resilient. People who are one-timer or newer, facing a new emergency situations, they become very, very vulnerable. Elderly people, they are very much vulnerable. Children are also very vulnerable. Persons with disabilities, they have a different sensitivity, and so they will show a different vulnerability. Similarly, people with chronic illness or mobility limitations, they will have a different vulnerabilities. So we should not have a static level within our organizations or within our communities or within our network that they are vulnerable. In fact, we should have a dynamic risk assessment, because as you understand that different situations, different context, different time, different exposures, they will make us more resilient, and from that perspective we will be able to grow and show a different level of vulnerability. because it is a exposure to emergency situations, and we don't quite often face emergency situations. So maybe somebody may have been exposed to 2 3 emergencies, but again we have we might forget, we might not have become very much resilient from our behavior perspective, and we might have similar vulnerability in terms of either individually or group. So that is how we need to keep on having a dynamic risk-based assessment, identification and assessment, and we need to engage with communities to see that how we can self-identify the needs of such kind of vulnerable people or vulnerable group. We need to have an inclusive planning and engagement with a vulnerable person or vulnerable group. And it's essentially good to have an early planning process. But again, it depends from the emergency situations. We saw certain cases, we might get some kind of, flexibility or some kind of opportunity that we can do some early planning. But in certain cases, we will not have even time to have a early planning. But if you look at from once we identify a vulnerable person or the group, we will be having a time of different possible scenarios of emergency, and then we can have a early planning. And we can see that how we can have a participatory approach to understand the real needs. And in that context, we may need to coordinate with NGOs or social services, healthcare providers, community and faith-based organizations. And that is how we can build trust and cultural sensitivity, so that in case of actual emergency situations, we really implement such kind of a planned arrangements that we already have. It can be implemented in the right perspective. Now, when we are talking about vulnerability management for the group or individual point of view, what we need is that accessibility of communication systems and informations. So we need to have a proper assurance or ensuring emergency communications. They need to be clear, they need to be very simple, they need to be multilingual as well. It should be accessible in terms of visual, audio, and all the plain language. We may need you to use multiple channels, maybe digital, maybe non-digital, maybe making a call, maybe certain WhatsApp message, maybe a WhatsApp group. We need to have a address of barriers. Sometimes we may have a language barrier, we may have a disability barrier, we may have a technology access barrier. So we need to also assess them, that what kind of people or a vulnerable group they need to have, a what kind of barrier they may have, and accordingly we can plan it. We need to of course provide a timely and consistent interactions through messaging, through any kind of communication systems. Let's go again, and we would love to hear from you. So the poll questions. Thank you very much for participating in the poll questions. Let's move ahead. And we need to have a targeted support and resource allocation. So we need to prioritize vulnerable persons in evacuation planning, sheltering and temporary housing, medical and psychosocial support, pre-identify critical resources, mobility aids, medication continuity, caregiver support, and we need to plan for continuity of essential services. We need to have a coordination, monitoring, and adaptations. When we are talking about coordinate across, we need to see that what kind of emergency service that we need to have, what kind of health and social care that we need, what kind of community networking that we need to have. And of course, once we are in a part of interactions, we need to keep on monitoring the impact on vulnerable groups during and after emergencies. And once done, we need to capture the lessons learned and adapt plan accordingly. So whatever plan that we have made for such kind of situations, we need to revisit those plans, and accordingly we can make it much more robust after having put those learning experience. And then, of course, we need to focus on long-term recovery and resilience, not only only on the response. We would love to hear from you again. So the next poll questions. This question is, what would help your organization most when it comes to supporting vulnerable person in an emergency? Thank you very much for for your participation in the poll questions. Let's go ahead. In short, when we are talking about supporting vulnerable persons in an emergency, it actually involves proactive and personalized planning, clear communication, and tailored assistance before, during, and after a crisis. So, key actions include establishing a support network, creating a personalized emergency plan with accessible transportation, compiling necessary supplies, including medication and equipment, and ensuring they are on local, official, community focused registries for priority assistance. Let us see that, when we are talking about such kind of system, that how to manage vulnerable group or vulnerable person in the best manner, what are the key strategies for supporting such persons? So first one is basically preparation and planning. It's basically pre-emergency scenario. We need to have a very good support network that we need to develop, or we can become a part of support network. As you also know from organizational context, when we have a emergency planning, but this one we are talking about from the little higher kind of emergency. It's a crisis kind of scenario. So if you have your emergency kind of scenario management, you know that similar to that, we need to have a identification of family, friends, neighbors who can help. And I think there was a connectivity issue. It got disconnected. Share PPT. Share PPT. Okay. Sorry for disruption. So we were talking about key strategies for supporting vulnerable person, preparation and planning. So develop a support network, individual emergency plan, assemble supplies, register with authorities, and that is how we can become part of a bigger group so that we can support a vulnerable person. Then during emergency, again, very important, communications, multiple communication method, texting, in-person check, calling people, evacuation assistance, ensure mobility devices are evacuated and have a plan accessible transportation if needed. Comfort and emotional support. There are certain, international uh, links which you can go through later, and then you can find it out how it can become a replica for all of us. Then, of course, respect independence as well for the people when we are managing vulnerability. Then we are talking about key strategies for supporting vulnerable person in vulnerability consideration. So accessibility, ensure safety measures are in place for individuals with disabilities, including certain guidelines are there for assisting people in terms of disabilities, how to do that. And that also you can access that. Then we have a type of vulnerabilities, which is vulnerable populations can include those with mobility issues, chronic illness, mental health conditions, the elderly and the children. Similarly, community support, utilize local community groups and the charities, how to make it tailored for supporting the vulnerable people. Post-emergency, we can have a wellness check and conduct request welfare checks so that, how we can bring the people back to a normal situation. Apart from that, rebuilding support, assist in cleaning up and arranging professional help and help with us insurance claim. All these kind of things can become part of our post-emergency situation. So now we have a question answer session, and I have received a few questions. I will take one by one to them, all of them. The first question that I could see, that is this standard only relevant for large organizations or government or such kind of scenarios? In fact, when we look at from that, as I was explaining, though when we were speaking out, it was giving an understanding that government and communities or statutory body or emergency provision organizations, though they are very much focused and applicable for them in terms of implementing such a standard, but any organization which is having a lot of variations in their persons group in terms of vulnerability, they can also implement this standard. So ultimately, it depends on what kind of team that we have and what kind of variations we have. And also, we need to be mindful that vulnerability is not dependent on the nature of the vulnerability. It is rather individual circumstances. So, for example, if I'm working in an organization and let's say I'm having some kind of, let's say, mental stress, and in certain situations of emergency, maybe flooding, or maybe let's say I lost my laptop, business laptop, I may become very, very vulnerable. So if you look at from that perspective, even a small organization or medium organization, they will have a different level of vulnerability, either in terms of individual or in terms of group. So if you look at from that perspective of individual context, time, how they are being exposed and how they are able to bring back the individual to the normal scenario, if you look at from that perspective, any organization can apply and implement such kind of a standard. The next question I could see that how do you balance the need of how do you balance the need to identify and register vulnerable individuals with privacy and data protection? Very good question, in fact. And of course, when we look at from the system of balancing the informations, so of course we will having a team members to manage various teams. So accordingly, the confidential informations or the data or the information that we need in terms of how to secure them, so it can become a part of information security, and we can manage it. And of course, the 27,000 standard that helps us in terms of how to balance in terms of data protection and their concerns and their privacy. It can be done. Next question, I could see there was one third question. No, I'm sorry. These were the questions. If you have any further question, please put it in the chat. Otherwise, you have the email link as well. you can send your questions, and we will be responding to those questions as well. I can see one more question. Where should an organization start if it has never formally considered a vulnerable person in its emergency? Very good question again. In fact, in this kind of situation, we should try to do an assessment of vulnerability, emergency situations, for example, flood kind of situation, war kind of situations, in terms of, let's say, business laptop getting lost, and people's vulnerability, their individual vulnerability situations. So from this kind of situations, conditions, and the people vulnerability, sensitivity of the people, we can do a mapping. And once that assessment is there, and then we can start in terms of anticipating, or if we have those kind of emergency scenario, we can build up in an emergency response plan. So every organization has an emergency response plan, and those emergency response plan can embed how to manage vulnerable person or vulnerable group, and that can be a part of emergency response plan. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. I hope there is no more question. However, if you still have a questions, please mail it to us and we will reply to you. Thank you very much.